Hello and welcome to English 2210, British Literature 2, and a lecture on Charlotte Turner Smith, potentially the first romantic poet. Let's get into it. I'm Dr. Maybe, and I'll be your guide. All right, so Charlotte Smith, maybe she was the first romantic poet. Let's investigate that and other issues with her poetry in today's lecture. So we'll be looking at some interesting details from her biography and the critical reception she received in her lifetime and a bit beyond that. To do that, I'm going to be drawing on the intro from the Broadview Anthology, which you have in your possession, and Stuart Curran's Introduction to the Poems of Charlotte Smith from 1993, which remains the premier edited edition, the scholarly standard, the touchstone of Charlotte Smith's poetry. That is the definitive edition. We will also be reading and looking at your reading assignment from the Elegiac Sonnets, first edition she published in 1784, which might be why she's the first romantic poet. When you look at, say, Wordsworth and Coleridge, 1797, 1799, looking at Blake, 1789, might beat him by a few years. And Beachy Head, which she published posthumously. So we have sort of the beginning of her poetic career and the end of it. And that is one of the few sketches of Charlotte Smith that exists. So you might be asking, why does Charlotte Smith matter to literary history? Why are we reading this person? So, two important things. First off, she is responsible as much as anyone, more so than anyone. Let's face it, it's really her who repopularized and revived the sonnet form. And she did it specifically by changing the way that sonnets worked, what they were able to cover topically, to instead look at the sort of emotional experiences that people in the Romantic era, in the French Revolutionary era, were feeling. The other thing she did was she was very important as a novelist. She wrote 10 novels, which is a whole lot of them, and she did that in roughly a decade. And that brings us, when I say us, I mean those of us who are studying the novel, which we're not so much doing in this class, but you did look at the origins of it, so keep that in mind as a point that we're continuing to discuss across the semester. She, in her novels, brings us from Fanny Burney to Jane Austen. A lot of times, if you're taking a class on 18th century novel, towards the end, you'll usually do Burney and then you'll do Austen. But if you drop a Smith novel in the middle of that, you can start to see some of the places where Austen got, I wouldn't say got necessarily her innovative moves, but they certainly look less jarring if you look at Smith in between those two writers. So, she also, of course, looks a lot at the plights of women under the law, as we'll see that is a recurring theme for Smith for somewhat biographical reasons, but also because of the era in which she lived, and also she brings up important debates from the French Revolution. So, she's really important because she revives one of the most important forms in poetry, repopularizes it, and she writes 10 novels that are really key to novel history. So you're not impressed yet? Okay, fine. Why else? Well, very few authors can claim Smith's popular and her eventual critical success as a poet or a fiction writer, let alone as both poet and novelist, and let alone in her era. Sure, she might be selling as many books as, say, Anne Radcliffe or Jane Austen. Maybe they sell a little more, but tell me Jane Austen's poetic accomplishments. Exactly. Great. Wordsworth, hugely important. Blake, hugely important. Did not sell worth anything, nor did they write novels. Really, she stands on her own in this case. She also did all of this not as a man who was able to be independent and have a wife look after him and all these other things. Instead, she became a professional writer and the sole financial support of her family with her 9 children. So work that one out, right? She has 9 children and she's doing all of that. So she publishes under her own name in an era that is not smiled upon. A lot of women were compelled to publish anonymously or under pseudonyms, even into the middle of the century. You have the Brontes publishing under male pseudonyms. You have Mary Ann Evans, better known as George Eliot. This lasts well throughout the 19th century. So the fact that Charlotte Smith is proudly publishing under her own name is really a statement. This is part of what makes her a truly brave and powerful person of her age. And add on top of that, if you're lamenting ever your life decisions and not having done something by a certain point, she doesn't start writing professionally until she's age 35. So, fade back, if you will. If I had thought ahead and had some music and maybe was a little more tech savvy, I'd give you a little sort of Jane Austen-y kind of music at this point, because she actually is born into a fairly opulent existence compared to the other poets we've met so far. She's born to a very well-off country gentleman, Nicholas Turner, who also has a townhouse in London. So she spends her time between Turner's estates and his townhouse in London. So she gets to be part of the fashionable city and, of course, go up to the country as well. She's one of three, and her mother died when she was 3 years old, giving birth to her younger brother. I believe she's the second of the three. She received women's education of the time, something we've talked about before in regards to Mary Estelle, Margaret Cavendish, Convent of Pleasure, of course, being, how do we get women a space of their own? Estelle trying to set up women's education. Eventually we'll get to Virginia Woolf. So she gets the best of what any woman at her age is going to do. She gets tutoring from a landscape painter around age 6. His name is also Smith, which is why I left it out. It's confusing. And she goes to boarding school between 8 and 12. And mostly what she learns there is that she's entirely too nearsighted for landscape painting. You might notice when you're reading her poetry that there's a lot of very close detail. And things at a distance tend to be more general. It's a strange thing, but it seems like her myopia, her nearsightedness, maybe led her to be a little bit more attentive to things she could be close to. I'm waving my hand close to my face, which you can't see, as opposed to things that she could see sort of at a good mid-distance. So she does some landscape painting, and she also learns dancing and acting. She's considered the best actress at her school, and when you look at her sonnets and her novels as well, which you won't be reading, but you look at those things and you see her capacity for writing under different personas, you maybe can think back to that acting training that she had. Also, this is, of course, not part of the instruction. How's this for living in the upside down or something? Instead of being told to read everything, right, having a syllabus that tells you what to read, instead, she was just reading everything she could on her own. She got what we would consider a better education based off of her own initiative, but maybe that's true in all cases. So, meanwhile, Nicholas Turner, who spent the last 12 years a widower, and his primary aspiration is looking good. He's kind of a Samuel Pepys sort of guy in the way that he's both a bit of a sexual predator and very concerned with dressing well. So he marries a young woman because she has a lot of money. 20 grand at the time is quite a lot of cash. I don't have a conversion on hand, but it's a lot. And a dowry, of course, is what comes attached to the wife that becomes in the man's possession. Think back to Convent of Pleasure. So, unfortunately, his young bride did not much like this very bright and vivacious teenager that Nicholas had, so he sought to marry off young Charlotte. You think that giving his arrangements and his marrying for money, his position in society, she could have gotten a better marriage. And indeed, she probably could have, except her father made really bad life decisions. So here you go, the first of many moments when Smith, who's far smarter than these men around her, is having life decisions made for her because she's a woman. So, her father arranges for her to marry 21-year-old Benjamin Smith, who's the son of a West Indian merchant. So a merchant makes lots of money, and Smith will inherit that, and he will be completely incapable of managing it. Both of them, though, let's be fair, both of them are completely ill-prepared for being married. They're both grown up in luxury. They have no idea what's going to happen. And incidentally, Mr. Turner marrying for money doesn't work out well for him either. So, within a couple of years, Nicholas and Benjamin's father both died, but due to complications. Now remember, these are very wealthy people, but Nicholas remarried, and the new wife didn't like Charlotte, so Charlotte doesn't get any inheritance. And Benjamin's father maybe might have had good intentions, but he wrote a very vague will, at a time when wills could be litigated for decades. Dickens' novel Bleak House, if you've ever read it or ever heard of it, is entirely about chancery court and about that thing of people's inheritances being tied up while they fritter away in poverty. So the upshot of it all is that they don't get any money. Because this is the way that rich people make money. They pass it from generation to generation, right? That's why they don't like things like estate tax and stuff like that, right? So, which I'm not justifying. In fact, I'm saying that's really greedy, but that's just an aside. You can keep going. Anyway, so Benjamin finds himself imprisoned for debt because even though he doesn't have any money, he doesn't know how to live any other way, and his family joins him in prison the following year. Strangely enough, i.e. not strangely at all, 1784, Smith publishes Elegiac Sonnets. She starts writing to make money. 1785, he gets out of prison and they flee to France to get away from their creditors. Later that year, Charlotte and her children return to England, and in 1786, she finally separates from this deadbeat guy. If you dig at all, if you want to do, work with Charlotte Smith for your upcoming research project, you'll find that Benjamin does not look good in any of the writing on him. He's quite a scoundrel. And remember, she and her children, all 9 of them. Some of them were still with their brother, but what have you. So from 1786 on, separated from her husband, she is the sole support for herself and her children through her writing. So, why did I bother to tell you all of this biography in this much detail? Because all of this really does feed into her work. This is the thing. Her personal life is very much determining her political outlook. This is her lesson in the world about the way things are. So she experiences firsthand how women have no legal standing. All right, you know all this by now, if not from what you've been reading in this class, from our discussions, what have you, that women, they don't get to vote, they can't hold property if they're married. That's right, that was the entire point of Convent of Pleasure. Still hasn't been fixed. I mean, it will eventually be, but I mean, in this period when Smith is writing, still not fixed. And so she ends up with no money because basically she gets disinherited and her husband can't handle anything. So, there's a good argument to be made that he was also there just primarily to swindle and what have you, but not relevant. What this comes out to is her view on seeing law primarily as a patriarchal structure. In other words, it is a system designed by men to benefit men, and women have no agency within it. In fact, they're only going to suffer within that. And so this is how a young woman of privilege, who might not have otherwise had the sort of consciousness raising that we're seeing here, comes to understand how difficult the world is. Unsurprisingly, novels sell better than poetry. You think that's just so now? I mean, how often do you read poetry on your own? I hope a lot, but probably not. Chances are your pleasure reading isn't going to be Wordsworth's The Prelude. I mean, mine sometimes is. But for the most part, we like to read novels. So, she publishes 10 novels over a decade, as I said, and pretty much the plot, we're not going to get too deep into any of these because we have a lot of other material to cover, but virtuous female protagonists struggling against these unscrupulous men and the patriarchal systems that endorse women's oppression. So these are underlying themes in her work, and we'll see this in her poetry as well. How did she learn to become a fiction writer? And I sort of bring all this up because if you are interested in professional writing or what have you, you're probably interested in how novelists end up doing what they're doing. At the very least, in studying literature, I like to know how writers end up being writers. So she takes, entirely to make money, translations of French novels into English. It's quick work, it's profitable, she speaks French, she's fluent, it works great. So, but her choices she made were really scandalous. Manon Lescaut, I note here on the page, violated the implicit gender codes of 18th century Britain, but more specifically, right, it was written by a priest. I forget his name, it's in the book, but it's written by a priest. It's translated by a woman, Smith, and it's about the heroine, Manon, who engages in some illicit passions and uses her sexuality to advance herself. How do you think the 18th century felt about that? Probably as good as certain contingents of Twitter and social media feel about anything women do, right? So, Moving along, she still writes poetry. The Emigrants, about 800 lines of blank verse. Blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. What's iambic pentameter, you ask? Hang on for a second. So Stuart Kern, whom I mentioned I was reading to help prepare for this, considers it, and he's pretty smart when it comes to these sorts of things. Cooper's The Task in 1785. Incidentally, that's how you say Cowper. It's Cooper, not Cowper. Right, Cooper. The Task in 1785 and Wordsworth's The Prelude in 1799. Normally, in kind of standard versions of literary history, former standard versions of literary history where we didn't talk about women's writing, we would skip right over. But now we kind of go Cooper's The Task, Smith's The Emigrants, Wordsworth's The Prelude in the progression of long poems in blank verse. She really lays down on, because The Emigrants is about, emigration. It's moving from France to England, England to France. What she does is take a look at the way that the systems on both the French model and the English model are really destructive, right? She looks at the expansion of empire, the slave trade, which she's incredibly against, right? The problems with marriage laws, in other words, the oppression of women, and problems with the class system. In other words, lots of wealthy people taking all their wealth and nobody else get anything. Now, isn't this interesting? Against empire, which is exploitation of other people, right? In other words, concerned about things like labor laws, as, a lot of ethical people today are. Where is my food being produced? How much are the people who are making it getting paid? Why are we going over into other countries and taking their stuff and calling it our own? Things like that. The slave trade. Why are people being treated as property? Marriage laws. Why do women have no civil rights? Class system. Why do the wealthy work by one set of rules and the rest of us don't? Sound familiar? Absolutely. Now think about this. When we were reading Cavendish, I was having to tell you things like, hey, she has really progressive ideas on one hand, but on the other hand, she's a royalist. Estelle is absolutely maddening because she's giving us so many progressive ideals, but at the same time saying, oh, Anglicanism, church and state, don't read novels, bad, be good, what have you. And we're like, how can you believe both of those things? All that stuff that I said there about Smith, empire, slave trade, marriage laws, class system, all that stuff absolutely looks like a coherent ideology to us. All those things are logically consistent to us. So you see why this is remarkable. 100 years before, you didn't have to hold all those ideas together. They weren't a coherent ideology in the way that they are by the 1790s. So really, we are the products of this time. For as much as we've changed, and as much of the 1790s, see, the 1790s really is this hinge between the ancient world, these sort of medieval, feudal ways of doing things, and the emergent modern commercial world. And she is right there in that, being one of those people crucially at that turning point. This pivot in time is where ideologies, political beliefs begin to look coherent to us. It's not that they ever have always been that. There is a historical moment when that occurs. And this is it. And that is remarkable. So, on to something you did read then. The elegiac sonnets. Here are some themes you can think about when preparing to write your response and reading or rereading, I would hope, because after all, poetry requires a little bit of review. So, there was a guy named Petrarch. He wrote the sonnet. What Smith does is reverse the gender roles in that, right? It's a lot of guys grumbling on about their sexual frustrations with women. She flips that. After all, a female voice writing the sonnet perhaps might want to explore something other than male sexual frustration, right? Instead, what Smith does is really explore what it's like to be sad. Now, not everybody is a fan of this sort of emotive, right? This sort of, emo stuff. Not everybody likes Rites of Spring, right? Her contemporary, Anna Seward, was one. She did not particularly like it. A perpetual dun on pity. She thought it was wrong for Smith to make depression look glamorous. I don't particularly agree with Seward on that point, but what have you. I'm just offering it there just so you know. Stuart Curran notes, and this is a really compelling point. I almost made this your exact discussion board. post, but I let it have a little bit of leeway. But if you're listening and you're thinking about how to, maybe think about what's making Smith so sad, this is the way to think about it, right? So the oppressive system readily apparent in her novels and The Emigrants, I'm sorry I missed italicizing the title of The Emigrants, is here, quote, an unspecified but pervasive omniscient presence that threatens the autonomy of the self that records it. So in other words, there's something kind of looming that remains unnamed that she's able to record and talk about within her sadness and depression, but it's the very thing that could destroy her. I think that's beautifully said on his part. So, in case you're wondering, what's a sonnet? Or you're like, yeah, I kind of generally know. Okay, let's review really quickly. Because you might notice that all of the elegiac sonnets are all the same length. They're all 14 lines. Incredible. Sonnets, therefore, are poems that are 14 lines. But more so, they're in rhymed iambic pentameter verse. There are also two types of sonnet, the Italian sonnet, i.e. the Petrarchan, and the English, i.e. the Shakespearean. So the Italian sonnet consists of an octave, which is 8 lines that are rhymed A, B, B, A, B, B, A, ABBA, ABBA. And yes, that is where that band from Sweden got their name. So A and A, those are the sounds that are the same. B are the sounds that are the same, right? And then there's a sestet, which is 6 lines that rhyme CDE, CDE, in other words, progressively 3 and 3, or the Sicilian, which turns into alternating rhyme, right? CD, 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 right? The other thing with the sonnet is that formally you will find a turn usually between line 8 and line 9. So the first 8 lines or so, especially in the Italian sonnet, will advance one idea. And usually around line 9, you will see a reverse or a flip on that, a change in the tone of the topic. And the last couple of lines, especially when you have them rhyming, so for example, the closing couplet in a Shakespearean sonnet where the 2 lines rhyme, will be the thing that pulls it all together. And you'll find that a lot of the sonnets here, if you're trying to figure out what she's going on about, read the last 2 lines, figure those out, and then backtrack through the poem, and you'll probably figure it out. As it is, they don't really, Smith and Wordsworth and a lot of the Romantics don't really work too much with the Shakespearean sonnet. They mostly work with the Italian sonnet. Some poets come up with completely different versions. Percy Shelley, for example, likes to come up with his own sonnets. It's rhymed iambic pentameter. It's 14 lines, but his rhyme schemes are all over the place. That is called a nonce, Nonce, sonnet, which is essentially what you call any sonnet that isn't Italian or English. All right. I've mentioned meter, so I should probably talk about that a little bit. You've most likely heard of iambic pentameter. So, what is an iamb? Well, an iamb is a poetic foot that has an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, right? There's accents on syllables. And if you put your accent on the wrong syllable, words will sound funny, right? So what you have to do when you're writing poetry or reading poetry is note everything has meter. How I'm speaking to you right now has meter. There's a cadence to my voice. There's a place where I pause in between words and what have you. Poets do those things and control them deliberately. They arrange stressed syllables up against unstressed syllables to create meter. It's exactly the same, more or less, as a drummer playing a backbeat behind a song, right? The most common, your standard AC/DC rock beat, right? Boom, tap, bass, snare, unstressed stress, right? So, nobody writes in perfect unaltered iambic pentameter. In the same way a drummer doesn't hold that exact same beat. They throw in a few fills, they do some other stuff, right? Instead, poets will mix it up with variations. You can do 2 consecutive stressed syllables. It's hard to do, but it does happen. Or you can do a trochee, far more common, which is the iamb backwards, which is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable, right? But an iamb is unstressed and stressed. It is the most common. English is built for iambic pentameter. We tend not to put our accent on the first syllable of a word. We tend to put it on the second, right? So one of the things sometimes in dialect in pronouncing words from in other languages and the like is that their cadence on words where they put the stresses is different from where we put ours. Further, with meter, there are also triplet patterns. Sometimes you'll see two unstressed in a row followed by a stressed. That's an anapest. And it's really cool because anapest, right? I mean, one of the fun things about this is some of these sort of do what they want. I mean, you can say spondee, and that's two stressed syllables, right? Or trochee, right? Do you hear how it drops? Trochee, right? Stressed, unstressed. Anapest, right? Because it's a pest, right? Unstressed, pest, stressed. Right? So that's how it goes. You're like, how in the world do you figure that out? Look at the dictionary and listen. A dactyl is an anapest backwards. It's stress, unstressed. That's hard to do in English. Dactylic hexameter works great in Greek. It's garbage in English. Pentameter refers to how many feet there are on a line. So there's 5 of those iambs. So there's 5 sets of unstressed and stressed syllables. So if you count your syllables across the first line of any of these Charlotte Smith poems, you will find there are 10 syllables. Sometimes there will be 11. Sometimes there might be 9. She might go really crazy and give you 12, sometimes even 13, but not often. But mostly 9, 10, 11, right? That's it. All right. So pentameter is 5. See, for all you heavy metal fans out there, or Wiccan people or what have you who think about pentagrams, why? 5 points, right? Tetrameter, that's 4, and so on, right? So, the thing is, you might be like, wow, I have to master all this? Nope. Like anything else, it takes a lot of work. I enjoy it. I like playing with it. I'm pretty good at it. I'm not nearly as good as some people, but I'm a whole lot better than others. But it's one of these things where if you are interested in this, because this is sometimes a little bit mind-blowing to think that, wait a second, human beings sit there with words, and it's hard enough to put them in an order to make them make sense. And on top of that, they're going to think about where the syllables fall. That's amazing. Yeah, it really is. Poets are really good at what they do. Now, of course, you might be going, is modern poetry like that? Usually not. Free verse happens in the first half of the 20th century and people kind of do what they want, but it still has a meter. All right. If you want some more, there's a link for you. Plenty more details than that. And if you're really super duper into it and want some books, shoot me an email. I'm going to take a guess right now. No one will send me an email to say, tell me more about form and meter. All right. Let's take a look at some of these. All right. So, to a nightingale. Poor melancholy bird that all night long. Okay, now that's not the way you would probably read it, but I'm trying to play up iambic pentameter for you, right? Poor melancholy bird that all night long tell'st to the moon thy tale of tender woe. From what sad cause can such sweet sorrow flow? Do you hear it? Do you hear that? If you really exaggerate it, poetry of this era was spoken, right? So speak these things, right? I mean, it's nice. You can just sit there by yourself, just say them quietly. But let's read it properly, right? Poor melancholy bird that all night long tell'st to the moon thy tale of tender woe. From what sad cause can such sweet sorrow flow? And whence this mournful melody of song? Thy poet's musing fancy would translate what means the sounds that swell thy little breast, when still at dewy eve thou leavest thy nest. Thus to the listening night to sing thy fate? Pale sorrow's victims were thou once among, though now released in woodlands wild to rove? Say, hast thou felt from friends some cruel wrong, or diedest thou martyr of disastrous love? Ah, songstress sad, that such my lot might be, to sing and sigh at liberty like thee. Now later on in the semester, you're going to read John Keats, and he's awesome. Have you ever read Keats? If you have, you know he's awesome. Whoops, hit my microphone there. Sorry. Got excited talking about Keats. So he's going to give you a poem called Ode to a Nightingale. Think back, if you will, to Smith's Nightingale when you do that, because many of the themes, the difference, the incongruity between human lives, where we are so conscious of ourselves and our fate, and the way that nightingale after nightingale after nightingale, right? To us as human beings, unless you're really good at ornithology, one nightingale is pretty much the same as any other. So for her, right, when she's talking about, pale sorrow's victims wert thou once among, right? Nightingales have been there throughout history, doing all these things, singing their songs. She asks these questions of them, and then asks it questions that she knows very well it hasn't, right? Have you been wronged by your friends? Are you dying the martyr of a disastrous love? Well, I am, Smith points out, right? Some people don't get into this, right? This is where Anna Seward's like, oh, please stop, right? But that's her question, right? As a human being, I've done these things, and I, a poet, right? A songstress said that such my lot might be to sing and sigh at liberty like thee, right? If only I could be as free as you are, right? That there's some potential for me, ultimately, to have, I don't know, the same sort of freedom that you have, but I don't. So, you see here, right? She's positioning herself between art, right, the poetry writing, and objective reality, right? Out there is a nightingale, and she's, corresponding with it. She's between those two places. So in this, her poetry ends up being both spontaneous, right? Oh, look, I saw a nightingale. Let me, produce a sonnet for it. It's the act of spontaneity. I don't know. Maybe she just wrote it in one go. I don't know. But also, this nightingale is legendary, right? It's been through all this time. It's a timeless thing, right? So it takes her personal sorrow, right? Her personal sorrow of being wronged by her friends, of her marriage being a catastrophe, and transforms it, transmutes it into this melodious song, to where she is once herself in her space and communing with the nightingale. That, my friends, is romanticism. So, she loves the night. Why? Because it's dark. Why? Because she's sad, right? I love the mournful, sober-suited. I always want to say somber there. It's a common misreading I've noticed. A few other people say it too. There's some way that, you just want it to be somber-suited because it's dark. But that isn't actually what she says there. It's sober-suited, right? I love the mournful, sober-suited night, in case you'd forgotten that we're still trying to count syllables, right? When the faint moon, yet lingering in her wane, and veiled in the clouds, with pale uncertain light, hangs o'er the waters of the restless main. You might see that sometimes, see that O''ER, that's the word over, and she's dropped the V. Why would she do that? Because of meter. Because if you have to say over, that's 2 syllables. If you have to say or, it looks like over, but it fits your meter better. That's entirely why they did that. In deep depression sunk, the enfeebled mind will to the deaf cold elements complain, and tell the embosomed, boy, that wasn't good, and tell the embosomed grief, however vain, to sullen surges and the viewless wind. So, in all of this, I still enjoy the cheerless as thou art, for in thy quiet gloom, she loves that, the quiet gloom, the exhausted heart is calm, though wretched, hopeless yet resigned. It's a sad place to be, right? I mean, these are poems of darkness and sadness and depression, right? But it's in there, it doesn't make her feel better. It just lets her know that there's something out there in nature, nighttime, that reflects her. So again, here she is, presenting this voice in poetry up against natural reality, right? The phenomenon of night reflects her mood. You might be like, yeah, but so what? Big deal, right? Daytime's all big and happy, nighttime's dark and mysterious. Yeah, okay, sure. This is 1784, guys. We're talking about being in love with the night and finding out there in nature something that touches us. If it's cliche, right? It's like the joke of trying to read Shakespeare and it was just a bunch of cliches. If it seemed like a cliche, it's because it's become that popular, right? She doesn't invent it. The Gothic novels invented a bit before this, but not by much, like 20 years or so. Still very much a new thing. So, Oh, also, before I forget, we should also remember this too. This is a female voice, and for her to open with a sonnet with a declaration of love, that's exactly what Petrarch would do. I love thee, whoever the heck he's in love with, right? But what she's saying is, I love thee, mournful, sober-suited knight. And it's not Knight, right? It's not like, we don't have medieval romance here. It's not the Black Knight or something. She's like, oh, I love you, mournful dude, right? Instead, she's saying, I love you, phenomenon. That's what I'm talking about reversing the gender roles and all this. She has the agency. She can declare her love. But she's declaring it to something in nature. That also helps her look like a proper chaste person, which is still very important at the time. So, I absolutely love this poem. This is probably one of my absolutely favorite poems, Smith or otherwise. It's this marvelous moment of the image of this churchyard and what's happening with these bodies, right? So pressed by the moon, mute arbitress of tides, right? Because the moon controls the tides, right? We know that. While the loud equinox its power combines, the sea no more its swelling surge confines, and the water rushes in, right? But o'er the shrinking land sublimely rides. The wild blast rising from the western cave drives the huge bellows from their heaving bed, the ocean bed, tears from their grassy tombs the village dead. So you have these tidal waves, well, not tidal waves, but just these huge, crashing bits of water coming in to this church that's really close to the ocean. And the bodies are being swept out to sea. What an incredible image. And she doesn't just stop there. Right? With shells and seaweed mingled on the shore, lo, their bones whiten in the frequent wave. So you can just imagine all of these skeletal remains looking, like there's been a shipwreck or something, but instead it's all because the graveyard itself has been washed out. It's an astonishing poem in terms of its evocation of place and feeling, the mood, the imagery that she uses. And then, of course, Charlotte Smith, going to be Charlotte Smith, at the end has got to turn back from that and say, while I am doomed by life's long storm oppressed to gaze with envy on their gloomy rest. To again say, oh, if only I could sort of have the gloomy, if only my fate was as good as having my bones splashing on the waves after being pulled out of my grave, right? It's pretty grim, but, that's pretty much where she's gonna end most of these. Like I said, your mileage might vary. I'm kind of into it. There are times where if I'm around enough cynical people, I can go, okay, yeah, lighten up a little bit. But ultimately, I think if you give yourself into it, you've probably, maybe you haven't felt quite as much as Charlotte Smith has, but they're lovely and dark and grim and macabre. I mean, hey, if you're listening to this, it might be Halloween, right? Who knows? All right, the lunatic. Here, right, he's unaware of his misery, and she's complaining about self-consciousness. On being cautioned against walking, which has a nice long title, walking and such and this and that and the other, because there's a lunatic about. It's one of these poems, too, where because she's a woman, she's been cautioned against doing something. So you can see the way that even though she's out walking and doing things, she's outdoors a lot. She is, right? That's cool. She actually got to, leave the house and do things, which hasn't happened with a lot of our female writers. She's out doing things, walking around, examining stuff, but here being told, uh-oh, be careful out there, right? So she knows, though, that out there is this lunatic. And for her, she kind of envies the fact that he doesn't know. Now, you might say, oh, what's to that? Well, in the 1960s, very influential French theorists Deleuze and Guattari offer in their book Anti-Oedipus, which is a sort of complaint against Freudian models of thinking, that a schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model for humanity than a neurotic on an analyst's couch. It's a great outrageous statement. And here too, right? It's this sense that, the insane are free in some way that we aren't. It's not a particularly good model of things, right? Because after all, we probably prefer to have our agency, and I give you a bet that the lunatic probably wouldn't too, right? I mean, he would too, right? He'd rather have his sense than not. But for her, look at what she's doing. And we'll see this again. Percy Shelley and Lord Byron will both focus a lot on that. Wordsworth did as well. A lot of focus on mendicants and the mad, more as social ills. For Smith, it's the case of them being somewhat touched with something almost otherworldly, right? And for her, then, not something to demonize or be terrified of, but in some ways to look on with sympathy, right? He has no nice felicities that shrink from giant horrors. Wildly wandering here, he seems, uncursed with reason, not to know the depth or the duration of his woe. You notice this is one, too, where the I voice, which usually comes in towards the end of the sonnet as, let me tell you all this stuff, in the final couplet, she sort of reasserts herself, in that here, it's, what's that, like line 12, I think? Yeah. I see him more with envy than with fear. And then after that, she stays with he's this, he's that, he's the other. So it's one of these, curiously, that doesn't fully turn back to the self in her case. I think that's a worthwhile thing to note. Maybe that's something to keep in mind, is when exactly does the I voice, right, the Smith narrative persona, come back in and say, here I am, right? Also as well, in talking about octaves and sestets, you'll notice the first 8 lines, line 8 ends with a question. With hoarse, half-uttered lamentation lies murmuring responses to the dashing surf, right? In moody silence on the giddy brink, I see him. That's the turn, right? She spent 8 lines talking about this, and then the turn for the sestet, those 6 lines there at the end. Brink, fear, shrink, here, no, woe, right? She's doing a few variations. Will instead bring us to this other contemplation, which is her own contemplation, but it's her own take on him. He is the subject of the last 2 phrases there, right? He has no nice felicities. He seems not to know. So, not a full return to the I, in that there's a little bit of a loss of self on her part, which perhaps thematically is echoing her desire to lose herself a bit, to lose that self-consciousness, right? Because it doesn't end on her being grounded back in herself, as so many of these other poems do. So, just a quick preview, a little bit to help you there. Play with some of the other ones. You can write on whatever you want in terms of like which poem you want to do for your response this week. So, let's spend a little bit of time with Beachy Head, which I know is daunting. My goodness, that's a lot of lines. It's shorter than The Immigrants, though. And it's amazing. You'll be overwhelmed by the number of footnotes, because it's absolutely massive. But this is pretty much, I mean, it might be unfinished. But it also, is it her masterpiece, right? There's something to be said as well. Stuart Kern really brings this out. A lot of the romantics, the romantic poets, had their best work early in their lives, right? Wordsworth wrote the Prelude 3 times, 1799, 1805, and the final version in 1850. He spent 45 years revising the poem between 1805 and 1850, and the 1805 version is far superior. Prior to that, though, what's the Wordsworth that really changes everything? Lyrical ballads. He was young. That means ultimately, when was Wordsworth's best work? When he was young. Smith, before she died, might potentially have written her best piece. That's another arc that a lot of the male romantics don't follow. And not just the male romantics, Mary Shelley, 19, when with Frankenstein. And after that, other novels, definitely good ones. But what's the one work we really know her by? The one she wrote when she was a teenager, right? So they sort of burned bright and early. Smith keeps getting better. So, quite often, you will find in the Romantic period your poet situated in a place. And usually it's something like a mountain, a cliffside, what I'm calling here just a massive landscape feature, right? And the poet is in lone observation there, right? And the ending of the poem, we're in the hermit's grave, so we're actually then inside of this landscape feature, right? And again, the loss of subject. If you want romantic poetic experience, I've moved from observation to death inside of the thing I was observing. Well, that's pretty good, right? as you probably saw or would see with Wordsworth, you see again with Coleridge, with a lot of other romantic poets, nature, even a lot of the prose writers, nature is multitudinous, right? And it can often be uncanny. That is, it's something that can seem at once familiar and terrifying. Wordsworth has marvelous moments in the Prelude where he's talking about he's stolen a boat and it's nighttime. He's a kid. He wants to go rowing, and he jumps in that, but it's nighttime and he's disoriented. And that's one of the things, right? With nighttime, if you're trying to find your way around, you can't see as well. So everything that should be familiar isn't. Although the uncanny in a psychoanalytic sense has a more ominous meaning to it than that. But certainly, if you read the Wordsworth passages, they seem quite ominous as well. One of the things, too, is that nature does something very different from human society and history, both of which she details in incredibly long footnotes. And she knows a lot about geology, and she knows a lot about birds. And it's sometimes it's a challenging read, Beachy Head, because you're frequently flipping between the text of the poem and the footnotes. If you have the time, just have your initial experience with it, which is probably flipping back and forth between the two. And then try reading the poem and just ignore the footnotes. Just try to just sit there with the poetry and just, you don't know something, whatever, just kind of work through it. Just, it's almost 800 lines. Just grab a section and do that. And then spend another where, you just read a footnote and you just sort of work with that. And then maybe after that, try to sort of see how these texts talk to each other, because ultimately they're competing narratives. And I mean, when you have pages where there's more footnotes than poem, it's visually competing too. So just keep that in mind. So why would she do all these footnotes? Why do we need all this? Well, just remember, women aren't assumed to know things. So for her to be able to say, hey, guess what? I know things, she's really got to prove her point, right? She has to try harder, in this case, to have the sort of authority that a Wordsworth would have just because he's male. So what does Smith do differently? Because if you think about it, a lot of things I'm telling you here, you could apply to most of your other sort of romantic nature poems, your greater romantic lyrics, as it were. So what does she do differently? Well, a lot of times Wordsworth, I would say Tintern Abbey gives us some of this, is a sense to kind of go beyond nature, right? Wordsworth has his experience 5 years before. He's having his new experience now, and there's something with nature that he needs to get beyond to arrive at his true poetic imagination. Again, to bring up Wordsworth's The Prelude, there's a section where they're going to see the Alps, and he ends up being disappointed when he sees them because the Alps he imagined were more impressive than the Alps he actually sees. And for Wordsworth, that disappointment actually confirms his own sense of the importance of poetry. That with words and ideas, he can construct a nature that is more powerful and more evocative than the trees and hills outside your window. All right. So Smith doesn't do that here, although you do end up sort of dying in it. So basically, I covered absorb and transcend there with the Wordsworth examples. So instead, and I think Wordsworth does this a little bit too, but I think Smith really, really, really does this, of where she's so focused on the way that nature is something absolutely weird. And you can't get past just how utterly strange it is. It is something that in many ways exists beyond us, and we are not part of, right? That's alterity. That's otherness, right? Nature, we are products of it, but it also seems so strange. And she really, I think, hits into that. Even though she's throwing science at it, she's throwing history, she's throwing all this stuff, nature ultimately is this, not unforgiving, but just indifferent, right? This sort of geological sense of time that doesn't process the same way that we do. And rather than trying to come up with ways to deal with that, I think she just sets it there, and it does that. It's also important to think about the way that nature is often rendered female in poetry, and that she's not trying to imagine it better or go past it, penetrate it, as the case might be, but instead acknowledge it and let it be there. Being a female poet might have something to do with that attitude. And even if it isn't just because she's female. Maybe it's something that male poets should think about too, right? Just because women poets bring this up first doesn't mean that only women poets should think about nature in that way. Remember, if nothing else, female experience is human experience. All right. So, no poet gets out of a PowerPoint or anything in this class alive. So, Smith died on the 28th of October. And just so you know, had I managed to get this done the day I wanted to, which was October 28th when I initially recorded this. Instead, today is October 29th, but I was trying to get it done on the anniversary of her death. Alas, enough other things in my life took over, so I'm a day behind. But anyway, I am recording this, and that just October 28th. This isn't going to mean very much when you listen to this in the spring semester, but it just might be on occasion that dates in history land at our own time when we're reading something. So, people were very sad. She was a very popular poet, and there was a lot of public sorrow, especially from many of her fellow poets. So, she had a lot of personal struggle to be independent because she couldn't be. She had a lot of misfortune. I mean that both in terms of bad things happened to her and she lost money. And her public position, though, as a popular writer, really made her a role model for other authors. So she's somebody to think about in light of romantic women writers. She's hardly the only female writer, but unfortunately, with the confines of what you can cover in a semester, she's the one I chose to be one of our representatives. So here she is in the pantheon of the class. And I think she's a really great choice, and I think she's a really spectacular poet. And I hope you enjoyed reading her poetry, and it will stay with you. Once you've read her, she's there. She exists. She can be with you and keep you company for the rest of your life. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation on Charlotte Smith, and that's all.